Previously on agentpalmer.com, an authentic backstory is exactly what you get from comedian David Mitchell's autobiography. The Castlevania animated Netflix series is a serious video game adaptation, and I've avoided Animal Crossing addiction with a mild case of Minecraft. This is the Palmer Files, episode 17, with biographer Brian J. Jones, author of 4 books covering Washington Irving, Jim Henson, George Lucas, and Dr. Seuss. We discuss lessons learned from those biographies, the writing process, and the value of one's own work. Let's do the show. Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 17th episode is biographer Brian J. Jones. As a biographer, Brian has written books on Washington Irving, Jim Henson, George Lucas, and most recently, Dr. Seuss. Of those, I've only read the George Lucas book, but it was such a fantastic read that I cannot recommend it to you enough. And all of the other books have been on my to-read list, which just keeps getting longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. Brian is a writer whom I respect, and I was really happy to have him on the show. Having an author like Brian as a guest was one of the motivating factors behind starting my own show, because I read a lot and I interact with authors on social media as much as I can, and before this show, there really wasn't a place for them in my circle on the microphone. And now, there is, and I couldn't be happier. I reviewed Brian's book, George Lucas, A Life, a while ago, but it's a truly fantastic read and one that you'll hear some of the creative process behind, as well as the process behind what he does, what it's like to move on from a project, and much, much more. So, if you want to discuss the episode as you listen or afterwards, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, you can tweet the show at The Palmer Files, and you can tweet Brian at Brian J. Jones. That's Brian J-A-Y Jones. You can visit Brian's site to see all of his works at brianjjones.com. That is the same as the Twitter with J-A-Y spelled out. And all of his books are available on Amazon or your local bookstore. Don't forget, you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, including the aforementioned review of Brian's biography of George Lucas. And remember, all of these links and those mentioned in the show will be available in the show notes. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Brian, I am a blogger by trade first before I'm a podcaster, and I've written stories of length, maybe like 10, 20,000 words, which are long for a blog, and I get sick of the material, and that's not a lot. You've written biographies of people. How do you not just not want to know anymore?
Well, I mean, the problem you have as a biographer is actually the research is the fun part, and you're never quite sure when to start. You know, you start off doing your research, and there's always one more thing you want to know, one more thing you want to know, one more thing you want to know. Eventually, you got to just sit down and start writing and figure out what you don't know until you don't know it, and then go get it. And then ultimately, again, biographers, we love the research, and you're constantly researching even as you're writing. And ultimately what happens is biography is never really finished as much as it's abandoned. You just never really feel that it's finished, that you've gotten everything. And you always close the book and send it off your final draft to your editor thinking, God, I hope I haven't missed anything big. It's an odd, like I said, they're abandoned. It's an odd place to be in biography. You never really get tired of it because you always feel like there's more you can know.
You've written 4, right?
Correct.
It was George Lucas, Jim Henson. I can picture the other 2.
Washington Irving and Dr. Seuss.
So they're all creatives.
Yes.
That was clearly not by accident.
Well, I mean, I wish I could tell you I had it all planned out. You know, I could be like George Lucas and say it was all on purpose, but it wasn't necessarily. I didn't start off that way. I started off with the Irving book, which I wrote it came out in 2008. I'd actually been researching that book for about 7 years before I wrote it. It was just a book that I wanted to read. I had gotten interested in Irving through his Christmas stories and, poked around and found out what I could about him. And found out he hadn't been the subject of a biography since like 1935. So that was a book and the book that was written in 1935, it's 2 volumes by a Yale professor who just absolutely clearly can't stand him. And you're always wondering why you would devote 2 volumes to that. But anyway, so it was one of those, it was a project I wanted to write, sort of a modern take. It was a book I wanted to read. So I got done with that. And at that point, I sort of thought I, had gotten it out of my system. And I was on Jim Henson's Wikipedia page one day and looked down at the bottom to check the sourcing on something, like anyone sources Wikipedia, but and saw there was no biography. And started a conversation with my agent and then on through the Henson company. And so it's all happy accident, I think, more than anything else. But it does turn out that, stuff ends up in your lane. When I got done with the Lucas book, that was one where I sat down and with my agent, my editor, and I said, what do we do next? And I told them, I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years. I can write about a president. I can write about politics. And my editor, who's a lovely guy, looked at me and he's like, Brian, stay on your shelf. And until he said that, I hadn't really realized I had a shelf until then. So, and that was sort of Dr. Seuss came out of that conversation. It's another one kind of on the same shelf.
Are you happy with having a shelf?
I am. The hardest part is it's really hard. I don't know what I'm doing next, which is the longest I've ever gone not knowing, because again, I tend to do names, and names, tend to be done already. So that's the hardest part, is thinking of somebody that's sort of in that, one of those big game changers, one of those big creative geniuses, the people that, find solutions to problems hidden in plain sight that nobody ever thought of before, that take their chosen field and do something completely new with it. Finding people that fit that mold is tough. And it's also tough because you always want to try to find subjects that feel worthy of what you've done before. So, moving from Jim Henson to George Lucas to Dr. Seuss, it all seems sort of like a natural progression. They all seem, equal among peers on there. So it's tough to look for. So it's a tough shelf in that regard, because again, you come up with interesting people and they've been done. And there's sort of a statute of limitations on biography. You got to pick somebody that, they can't have been done in maybe the last 10 or even 15 years. And everybody's always got a great idea for who you should do as well. But the other issue with biography is you have to live with that subject for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 7 years sometimes. If you're Robert Caro, 50 years. And so the fit between biographer and subject is really key as well. I mean, there's plenty of, subjects that are really interesting that haven't been done that I'm probably not a good fit for. So that's one of the hard parts about biography. It's a little different than almost any other form of nonfiction.
I've read the Lucas book, which was absolutely fantastic. And if I haven't already promoted it in the intro to this episode, and I probably should have, and I will, I'm going to promote it at the end too. I want to give you a kudos, and then I want to ask you a question. First of all, I had no idea that was not an authorized biography until I read your acknowledgments where you acknowledge that it's not. That I am so astounded by how well that story's told, not being authorized.
Well, I mean, and the Henson book wasn't technically authorized. I had their cooperation, but authorized tends to mean that if there's something in there they don't like, they can stop it. Anyway, but the difference between, for example, Henson and Lucas is with the Henson, I had to, the Henson family participated and permitted me into their archives. Lucas gave me nothing. I made a run at him, and I actually got an email back from him or his assistant, which I guess was as close as anyone's ever gotten, telling me no, which again, everyone that I talked to later said he actually told you no. Usually he doesn't say anything. But the thing you'll find about Lucas is, even though he considers himself very private, is that he talks a lot and has been talking on the record since about 1967. So there was actually a lot more out there than I think even he realized. And the way I like to work is, and I hope you got this out of the book, and I'm pleased that you didn't know that he hadn't participated, is because I like to let them tell the story as much as I can. So it's a hunting game. It's going out there and, wrapping your arm around as many sources as you can find. And one of the things that was very helpful with the Lucas book is, he sat for interviews a lot. And what tends to happen is, he'll sit and talk to somebody and they'll have 80 inches, 80 column inches. I know people can't think that way anymore, but like a newspaper story that was 80 column inches and it ran in the LA Times. And because they're the LA Times, they ran about 15 inches of it and then threw the rest away. But if you're looking in the newspapers in Omaha, they need content and they ran the whole thing. So, going through online resources like newspapers.com and things like that, and going through some of those, smaller newspapers, you could find these gigantic interviews that nobody'd really been able to plumb before because you're primarily working out of the New York Times and the LA Times and sort of the bigger newspapers.
That is beyond fascinating, because my only experience in that regard is 5 or 6 years ago, I went on an eBay quest for old Playboys because I stumbled onto one, and I don't know who it was, but I read, it was like a famous movie director, and I read, it's not like a biography, but like an interview / biography with him.
Right.
And it just went on, it was like it was a 70s Playboy, and it just went on forever. Like I was reading this going like, I can't believe how much is going on. Like the conversation, it was like a real podcast. Like if anybody's listened to Mark Maron, like think of that in written form, just in a Playboy. And
that's a really great comparison. I mean, it's like, Playboy, you could read for the articles. Jimmy Carter did a huge sit down with them. And like you said, it goes on and on. Rolling Stone did the same thing.
And so I've started going through like these older magazines to try and just find out more information. Plus it's happening in real time. At that point in time, Playboy was interviewing like people in the news.
Yep.
So you're getting, things almost as they were happening, like as a precursor to the unfiltered 24-hour news cycle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm now going to have to start looking at like older, non-major market newspapers too. I had no idea that was out there, but as a treasure trove, that must be, I mean, you must have read so much that didn't make the book then.
Yeah. And it is a treasure trove, and it's these gigantic on articles. You're like, this isn't, the Oklahoma City newspaper, these humongous articles, because a lot of times you read the same old quotes that people use everywhere. And you're finding Lucas. And what I love about sources like that, and the reason I like to find things like that and let my subjects tell the story in their words, is because when Lucas is talking with, Rolling Stone in 1976, he doesn't know how this is going to turn out. And he's just got, he's great in this long piece he sits for at that time because he's pissed off. He's mad at the studio. The studio's abandoned him. They didn't give him any money. They don't have any confidence in him. And he's going to be lucky if this movie makes a dime. And I love that sort of thing. I mean, you are finding them. They don't know the future. And I like that because it's different almost than sitting down, had I actually gotten him, and sit down with them and you say, tell me how it happened. And then they get to tell it almost in this third person narrative. It's so much more exciting and so much more dramatic, I think, when you get them in first person when they don't know what's going to happen.
Now, when you write a biography, do you start with the concept that it's going to be a linear story? Or is it just see what the research tells you and maybe it'll be slightly out of order or whatnot?
No, I tend to do straight ahead linear chronological narrative because I don't really know any other way to do it. And because with the subjects I write about, it tends to be sequential in the sense that because they did this, then this could happen. And then the lessons they learned from this then apply to what came next. So I think really the best way to tell those stories is just to tell it in order. And again, for me, it's a choice because I'm not sure I could do it any other way. But I find, as I was just talking about with, listening to them talk in first person before they know what's going to happen, I think there's more of a drama when you're reading straightforward and, your subject doesn't know what's going to happen. And I always hope that you as a reader, there's almost this tension as you're going along where the next chapter, you're reading about Jim Henson, the next chapter is The Muppet Show. But as we're reading along, I'm telling you, nobody's buying this pilot he's doing. He's 3 strikes and he's out. Who's going to pick this thing up? He doesn't know what's going to happen. And you as a reader know, but I'm stringing you out in a sense because you sort of know in the back of your mind, at least if you're a fan, where it's going. But in the narrative, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to start off the book saying, and he was hugely successful in 1976, and that starts you off The Muppet Show. Now let's get in the Wayback Machine and tell you how we got here. I'm not necessarily clever enough to do that. I know some people are, but for me, I tend to work best in just straightforward chronological linear form.
Now, you've written about people that were alive and dead now. Do you feel any kind of different weight either going in or as you're researching it?
No, and that's a great question. No, because first of all, when dead is easy. Dead is easy because it's laid out. Like you know the beginning of the story and you know the end of the story. When I was doing Lucas, who was very much alive, it kind of keeps the goalpost moving as you're writing. Because as I was writing that, I was thinking, oh my God, what if he dies while I'm writing this? You know, that changes the nature of the book at that point. Whereas as I was closing in on the final chapters of it, you know, at that point, I've got my eye sort of almost frantically on the newspapers. And I have a Google crawl, even till this day. I get an email every day that has every, you know, time George Lucas's name is in the news, I get an email for it. And so I had that going so I could find out, you know, what is he doing? Because I need to keep this as up to date as I can as I approach the last chapter on this. And in fact, the very last quote in that book, which I love, he was sitting for an interview and they said, what's going to be on what's your epitaph? And he laughs and says, I tried, which I just absolutely love that line. That was in like a December 30th, 2015 interview he did with like Charlie Rose. And I wrote the last words of that manuscript like in February. Wow, so it had really only just happened because again, you're just keeping your eye on the ball as you're going, but the story keeps going on. So, you know, it was as up to date as I could get it. And then I think even when the paperback came out, I had gone back again because we'd had, I think The Last Jedi was ready to come out. So I tried to at least get some of that in there as well. So yeah, so there's challenges in dealing with a living subject that there aren't with dead, because again, the story's sort of done with that. This one, it's continuing to be written even as you're going along.
So what is your, I want to say, mindset after you hand in the manuscript, since you still have this Google alert for him? Like, what's that like when you see like, oh, another alert came in and my manuscript's in my editor's hands? Like, what's that cannot be, I don't know, comfortable?
Well, it's a little unnerving because when I finished so for the hardcover, when I turned in the manuscript for that, and it had a pretty short lead time. The nice thing is my editor at that time, he was over at Little Brown and he was like senior vice president. So his books could go to the front of the line. So I turned in that manuscript like February and the book came out in December, which is a really short turnaround. So I wasn't, you know, it wasn't like you're sitting there and you've got, you know, the Jim Henson book, when I turned it in, it didn't come out for another, 16 months or something. But this one, because, we had a fairly short turnaround, I could keep my eye on that and just hope nothing big was going to happen that was too close to the deadline. But the one big thing that was going on was he was still trying to place his museum. Like he had a museum, he had $1 billion museum he couldn't give away. And he was still trying to figure out where he was going to go. And it ended up finally going to L.A., kind of near his alma mater at USC. But that was all still going on. And when I was writing that manuscript, I was like, God, can we please settle this while I'm doing it so this is in here? It ended up not being in the hardcover. It's in the paperback because of that. So, those are the kind of things. The biggest thing that would have just really, would have changed the nature of the book and, would have made it to a different launch. It had he died while I was still working on it. And, that happened when with the Steve Jobs book. He was writing that book and, actually ran and Walter Isaacson interviewed Steve Jobs practically on his deathbed and put that book out maybe, 2 weeks or something after he died. The publisher put it out. So it changes the nature of the book if that happens. Not that I was hoping he died, but yeah, you sort of hope nothing cataclysmic happens between the time you turn that in and the time it comes out.
So I want to go backwards, unlike you in the linear nature of the story. And I want to ask, what did you want to be when you grew up? Did you always want to be a writer?
I wanted to be a comic book artist for a long time when I was a kid. When I finally got into high school and college, I was, I wanted to do something with writing. And when I was an English major and I was an English lit major, I wasn't really into, creative writing or anything, but I was a lit major. And, worked on the college newspaper. And then my first job was I worked on Capitol Hill as a congressional aide. I worked in the U.S. Senate, and I didn't know at the time, but that was actually good prep for biography, and I'll get back to that in just a second. So, but when I was in college, you this kind of happens to you when you're in your 20s and late teens, early 20s, like you fancy yourself a great artist and great novelist, and I was going to write a novel and write a book, and I sat down even at one point. I thought, well, I'll at least start off writing a children's story, and I just could not do it. I can't plot. Ringo Starr has this great story where he talked about going away and writing a song and would come back and play it to the rest of the Beatles, and they all say, "You do know that that's Sentimental Journey." As he said, there I'd gone rewriting another classic. And that's kind of what I was doing when I was trying to come up with fiction. I'd come up with some plot and I'd explain to people and they'd say, that's actually an episode of Star Trek. So I was really terrible at that. And then I sort of dropped it when I went off to work in the real world. But so I worked in the U.S. Senate, and your job in the U.S. Senate is your boss will come to you and say, somebody wants to introduce legislation that does X. Tell me about this. Should we do it? How does it work? So you go out and you read everything you can on that subject, and you talk to people, and you find people on both sides of the story, and you read everything that's been read that you can find about it, and you talk to the Library of Congress, and then you write it all up and try to make it as short as possible to give your boss your opinion. And that turned out to be really good practice for biography, though I didn't know it at the time. So it was sort of serendipitous that I had done that in my career at that point. But I didn't really think about writing a book finally until maybe 19. I think I was still working on it the whole time. It was probably the late 90s when I fell in love with Washington Irving, but I had no idea how to go about doing it. And what I actually finally did was I bought. Remember, there was a whole series. It was like not the dummies, but it was like the Idiot's Guide.
Yes.
Like I actually bought the Idiot's Guide to Getting Published. That talked about when you do nonfiction, it's a very different creature than writing a novel. Like you don't have to have the book done. You write a proposal, but you need to have an agent. So you should write a pitch letter to it. I went through the whole thing, and this is back in the days when you had to lick a stamp and put it in an envelope and mail it off. And that was sort of how I broke in the early 2000s, was that way. But I kind of thought that it was never going to happen, because I knew I was a terrible novelist, and my dream job was I wanted to write detective comics with Jim Aparo as my artist on Batman. But I'm sure I would have started writing a Batman comic, and someone would have said, "This is what Steve Englehart did back in 1988." So,
while you don't know what biography is next, is there is fiction gone? Is it a possibility you'll return to it?
Well, there's nothing to return to. I've never actually done anything. Okay. I don't think so. I'm not wired that way. I don't think. I have a friend who's a screenwriter, and he's one of these guys. You'll give him you'll say something, and you'll see him cock his ear, and he'll say, "That's a great title," and he'll go and write it down. And then you go to his apartment, and he's got notebooks literally stacked up by his bedside that have random bits of plot elements or little vignettes written out longhanded. I could never do that. I'm just not wired that way.
Yeah, from experience, I've written a few pieces of fiction. I say dabble in a little bit in the last few years. I've been blogging for what feels like forever, and I'm not going to say it's formulaic because I write about different topics and mediums and genres and all sorts of things. But to change gears and make it up completely and not have it be opinion, or even, to tell a story. And, I wrote, 20,000 words on the story of a podcast my friends did.
Uh-huh.
To turn that and start writing fiction, I almost have to reprogram my brain for a little bit.
It's a big, yeah.
And I can understand why, I've done it before, so it's slightly different, but I still look at what you've done in a full book and go well, I don't think I can do that. I don't know. Obviously it's pages, it's column inches, it's words, it's more research. But I find a wall. I wrote a personal story, right?
Right.
I sat down one day, I wrote 95% of it out. At least, for the stream of conscience, let's get from point A to the end as quick as possible. It was 7 pages. I haven't gotten back to it yet because it feels like a wall I've built that I can't get to the inside anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, you're looking through the bars at it.
Do you have any tips or is because you're always, your subjects have been written about at the very least in newspapers. and magazines. So you always have this influx of research. Does that make it easy when you're starting to put the whole thing together?
Well, I mean, it's not fair for me to say yes on that because my wife is a chemist, and my wife will tell me, she's got a PhD in chemistry, and she's like, well, chemistry's not hard. And I was like, yes, it is, because if it wasn't, I would have a PhD in it. So it's one of those, like, I don't find it necessarily that hard, because I always say you have to be able to see it. And I can see it. And when I tell my wife that, she says she can see chemistry, and I never could. I tried to visualize chemistry, and like I found out later I was what they called a dry chemist, meaning I never did it right and always faked my data. And like my math would always come out where my neutrons were, like the size of a basketball. So, but you have to be, I think you have to be able to see it and to be able to hear it. The one thing that's, so I always tell people who write fiction, that we especially as biographers, and I'm sure historians have the same issue as well, but, it's like we're so envious of you guys who can go sit and write with your laptop in a coffee shop, because everything you need is in your head and in your fingertips. Whereas we sit down to write, and you're sitting there, you get to a point and you say, okay, well, so George Lucas he's in Modesto, and he goes to college. He's got to go to college. Let's see. How do you get to college? Well, I'll just say that he got on an airplane and flew down there. Well, I can't do that. I have to know what actually happened. So we can't go to coffee shops because we have to have all of our crap with us. And I'm very analog in that I print everything out and I punch holes in it and I have it in binders. And for Lucas, I think I had 22 binders or something of information, and so we have to have all that junk with us to do it. So it's a different skill set in that when George Washington was getting ready to cross the Delaware, we have to tell how they got in the boats and not in a land speeder. And how, it would have been easy if you would have had, a blaster instead of, a bayonet or, a musket. We have to work with what really happened. And that can be very limiting. And it's very freeing, I would think, as a novelist to, only be limited by what you can imagine happens.
See, and to me, what you just described, the limiting part for me, and I have to go back to college the last time I actually did this, but the citation part, I have all the respect in the world for you, because I remember lamenting that. Like, that was the part, like, just let me write this thing. Don't, like, I'll give you all the sources, but I don't want to stop in the middle of a flow of writing to tell you where I got it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it's one of those quirks of writing that we as nonfiction writers have sort of come to accept. And we have to be very careful about that. I was telling a story, and I wish I could remember what the quote was, but I remember, I think it was even in the Dr. Seuss book, I was writing a chapter and I had named the chapter, I had used a couple words out of this great quote that I had from him. And I'd written the chapter and I got done with the book and I turned it in. And I even had the quote in that chapter, and it came back from the copy editor and she had marked it and said, you didn't actually source this quote. And I was like, oh my God, oh, okay, well, let me go back and find, for the life of me, I could not find the source on it. And if you can't find the source, you can't use it. So I had, so I lost the chapter name because it came out of that quote, and it changed sort of the thrust of the chapter because that was defining the direction of that chapter. And anyway, so it's one of those things you have to be very careful about, because one little slip like that even can wreck your chapter. I tend to take all of my quotes and I do what I call the data dump, where I go in, like I'm getting ready to start chapter 8, and I take every quote that I know I want to use so far in chapter 8, and I just go into my document and I just type them all in. And then like I'll type New York Times article, August 17th, 1986, and I'll have the source, and then I'll just type every quote from that underneath it. And so then when I'm writing the text, the first time I use a quote, I'll do a full source. And then the next time I use it, I'll just put in brackets next to it, New York Times story. So I know where it came from, so I don't have to stop too much and source it. So I've sourced it the first time, so the full link, the full end note is at the end. And then the next time I'll just write New York Times story, New York Times story, Smith interview, things like that. And then I go back later and fill them in. But it's like I've always got them all sort of sourced at first in the full document before I start writing it. So for that very reason, because I don't want to lose the sourcing, because I have had sources disappear before, and you're just devastated when that happens.
And when you're writing, do you get in what I like to call a rhythm, where it's just, all right, I know exactly what I'm supposed to be writing right now, and as long as I don't stop, I could probably just go to the end of, this chapter, this whatever.
Yeah, I have to, I'm an outliner, and I generally know where my chapter begins and where it ends. I also am I like dramatic cliffhangers, so I usually know exactly where my chapter is going to end. Like I know I've got a great quote it's going to end on, or it's got a great scene I'm in. So I almost think almost like in scenes. And the trick a lot of times is to just, go from it sounds terrible because it sounds like you're just going A, B, C, D, but you've got great stuff going on in the chapter. You want to be sure you get from point A to point B to point C cleanly. And that can often be the hardest part. What I tell people a lot of times to do is go in and write one sentence and say, in 1957 he did this, and then go down, hit return 7 times, and then say, and then his wife got in a car accident, and then hit 7 returns, and then say, and then in 1960 this happened, and then go back and start filling in the details around each of those sentences. And that helps you sort of start to build the structure at least. But you know at least you hit the high points of your narrative, you hit the posts you want to hit, and then you start filling in to do that. And transitioning is the hardest part a lot of times of nonfiction, and sometimes you just have to cheat it. And you get to the point where you're like, I don't know how to go from this point to this point cleanly, and that's when you'll see us every once in a while. We stick in about 6 asterisks.
Yep.
That you just move over. So it's like cut scene, and go to the next one, and that's sort of the way we get around that. Sometimes you just get stuck.
Is there a balance to the amount of detail that? I mean, obviously some scenes are more than others. Like, I mean, reading the Lucas book, I knew as you were approaching, say American Graffiti, that was going to be the next project he worked on. Everybody's I'm not going to say everybody, but most people who are reading a book about George Lucas probably have, something in mind when they're reading about right. American Graffiti and Star Wars. So is there a level of detail that you take me as the reader, into consideration, or is it just from a storyteller perspective where you're just trying to tell the best story and it's, you're going to help the reader along, but you're not going to cheat them either?
I think the worst thing you can do is not keep your reader in mind. One of the first things I do on some books is I have my wife read them, because she's the one who's able to tell me if something is boring. And usually what happens there is I put too much detail in because I had all this great information and I wanted to use it all, which again is what you do as a person who writes nonfiction. Even if it's journalism, you've got great information and you want to use it all to show you did the research, to show that you're a serious researcher. I think you have to keep the reader's ear, if you will, in mind on pacing and things like that. So, so something like in the Lucas book, for example, you as a reader, for the most part, people come into Lucas knowing somewhat what his big stories are. Some people are actually surprised to find out he did American Graffiti, but they know Star Wars is the money shot in there, and they want to get to Star Wars quickly. But there's a lot that goes on in Lucas's life that's really important, that makes him the kind of person he is who can make Star Wars. So, actually the filming of Star Wars in that book doesn't come along until the second section. It's about halfway through the book. And so, you have to make sure you understand and manage the reader's expectations in that, look, we're not going to start off, 20 pages. First he was born, then he went to college, and then he made American Graffiti, and now let's talk Star Wars. You have to, it's like the line in Amadeus, you can't make too many demands on the royal ear. But you have to be sure you're true to your subject. I mean, one of the ways I get around that, if you will, is you notice in the Lucas book, I start you off with a prologue where he's filming Star Wars.
Yes. So
when you open the book and you start reading, you're in the middle of Star Wars already, which is where you want to be. And it helps you set up the theme, which is, I love that I patted myself on the back for being clever on it. The name of that chapter is of the prologue is Out of Control. And a lot of it's about how R2-D2 didn't work. He would go out of control across the desert. But the bigger theme is Lucas had lost control of his project and, vowed that was never going to happen again. That's what makes him George Lucas, is he wants complete control of those projects. So, it helps you sort of cleverly set up the theme. But you're managing the reader's expectations. You get to see Star Wars. Now let's go and see how we got there. So, that's probably one of the few places I think you'll see, Jason, where I do go out of order. But it's in the prologue, so I don't consider it cheating.
Is there I mean, and this is a cheap shot question. I apologize, but like, they are creatives. It is your shelf. Have you found a common thread, or maybe like an underlying theme, whether it's through what you've put out in the book or just from your research?
I think one of the things that binds, even going back to Irving, all four of them is, they're all people who knew the value of their work, weren't going to compromise their art because there was easy money in it. There's a moment in Washington Irving's life, for example, when he is determined to make it as a writer. It's right, he's at work on the short stories that eventually become the sketchbook, where Rip Van Winkle is and Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And he's been trying for his entire life to, just get a cozy government job so he doesn't have to really work anymore. And, he wants this government job so he can actually afford to be a writer. And he has no money, and he's stranded in London, and he's somewhat miserable, but he's writing these stories. And his brother, who's a congressman, I almost had called him, writes him and says, I've got a job for you. You need to come back to the United States and you can become, the assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. And Irving says, no, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to get this done. Is it going to compromise that vision at that point? And this is what happens repeatedly through Jim Henson and George Lucas and Dr. Seuss, and things like marketing with Lucas Seuss and Jim Henson. Like, they were all determined to control that marketing. They knew their art had value, that their art had worth. And they weren't going to sell that out or let someone take the control away from them. Henson's another one who's very much about the control of a project. And when it came to merchandising, he had to put his hands on everything and approve it personally. George Lucas did that. Dr. Seuss did that. These are people who inherently knew their art had value, that their art had worth.
I guess I'm going to tell you a statement and then ask you the question, which is, I have trouble finding value in my own things. So when you say that that's a common thread, and I can easily see it, I also feel like that's not a common statement. I feel like anybody I know who's in marketing, selling themselves is the hardest thing they'll ever do. So do you see that same value in your work? And did you, before you saw this through line for all of your subjects?
No. And it's a lesson that I think all of us as people who do anything creative have to take to heart, because it isn't something, that, you have people that will say, well, in a time like this, when people are stranded at home and they need healthcare, go get a job. We don't need art. And I think many of us would argue this is the time you especially need art.
This is absolutely the time. I mean, everybody's turning to whatever service they can get.
Yeah, they're all watching, they're watching movies and things like that, which is all art. It's not, it's art that, you're paying for, but it has a value. And I think that's the message that I take away, that I try to embrace, which is, our natural instinct is to be, for a lot of us, is to be self-deprecating about our work and about ourselves. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody. But, these are the guys who say this is, it was fun to do, but it was hard work, and it's something of value. I mean, there's a moment in Jim Henson's life when he's still a young man, and he's, created Rolf the dog for a commercial. Rolf was actually created for a Canadian dog food commercial back in like 1961, something like that. And his agent, Bernie Brillstein, comes to Jim and says, this dog food company actually wants to just buy Rolf outright. And they want to give you, this outrageous sum of money. And this is Jim, who's, still an up and comer and doesn't have a lot of money. And Jim would have been, set, at least for the next decade. And Jim turns to Bernie Brillstein and he says, Bernie, never sell anything I own. And I love that line and really try to inhabit that line. Don't always succeed, but that's one of the things that I try to keep in mind, for that there's value, and understand the value of your own work.
Okay, so the real question I have now is a side note, which is, how many of the Wilkins coffee commercials did you watch for the Henson thing? And like, how deep down did you go? Like, did you watch all of them?
I did. I think most of them are on YouTube nowadays, but back when I was writing the book, nobody had them. And the Henson company actually provided me with a DVD that had all of them on it. So I just stuck it in on my laptop and sat there. And I think if you watch them all in a row, it's like 42 minutes or something ultimately. And I remember seeing an interview with, I think it was Matt Groening or one of the writers of The Simpsons, who said, people used to tell them, you guys should do an Itchy and Scratchy movie. And he said that, they sat down and they strung together all the episodes of Itchy and Scratchy they'd ever done, which only last about, 10 seconds a piece. And he's like, after 3 minutes, it's just brutal. And, you just don't want to watch it more. And that kind of happens with Wilkins and Wonkins. It's just, doing terrible things with each other over and over and over again. After a while, it's a little exhausting. And so it's one of those you kind of have to take in bites because they're very funny and they're very clever. But, seeing something terrible happen to Wonkins every, 16 seconds is a lot.
and we know what he becomes. Like we know what that's the start of as well. So there's a projection that we're putting on those puppets, knowing that they're the beginnings of the Muppets, basically. So we're not watching this as just we would have been had we watched TV back then.
Well, I mean, they came out of the already sort of established version of the Muppets on Sam and Friends. But I mean, what I think is really cool and kind of key about the Wilkins commercials is it's Jim's humor and sensibility on full display, and seeing a solution to something that nobody ever thought of before that now we're all like, well, of course you would do it that way. So when I talk about Jim Henson and I start talking about the Wilkins commercials, the first thing I do is I show them what a typical coffee commercial looked like in 1958. And it's 10 seconds. And the Wilkins commercials are 10 seconds. And it's this pile of beans that look like they're roasted, and it's like, rich coffee flavor, $1.98 at your local grocery store. Come get Rich Taster's Choice now. And that's it. It's just like a picture of the coffee with a voiceover. And then you show Wilkins right after that. And I mean, there's just no comparison. It's no wonder people went bananas for those. They didn't look like anything else. And who would figure, how you get people's attention to buy a product? You make them laugh. And they'll associate that laugh with the product. And Wilkins' product went through the roof after that happened. But, of course, that's the way you do it. That's the way advertising works all the time now. But nobody had really thought of that in 1958.
Yeah, it's probably one of the first viral marketing campaigns.
Absolutely. Everybody wanted them. And Jim went and used sort of the same conceit for a lot of different products and sold bread that way, and tea in Boston, and coffee down in Louisiana. And what I love about that, too, is he didn't just redub the vocal track over the existing commercials. He actually went and shot them again so the lip movements would line up.
Speaking of like things have changed, you released your books in an era of audiobooks. Is that all publisher? Do you have any input as things are getting read?
No. Usually you're completely in the hands of the audio department, who are fantastic at this stuff. Usually what has it's you don't really have, you don't get to say yes or no. You don't have all the proof, but any smart audiobook producer will come to you and ask your opinion on things. And they've always done this. They're fantastic at it. So, for example, when they were doing the Jim Henson audiobook, they sent me, 4 different samples. They're like, these are 4 people we're talking to that we're considering for the Jim Henson book. Tell us what you think. And, so I listened to them and I wrote back with my input and my opinion. And there was one that I really liked. And I said, but can you send me audio of him maybe doing Jim? I said, you're having him read exposition, but he's not getting to do any of the voices. Can you maybe have him read a chapter from the Muppet Show section so where I can hear him do Jim's voice and Frank Oz's voice and so on? And they said, oh yeah, good, great. That makes perfect sense. And so they sent me another little audio file that I listened to, and I said, this is the guy that I really like. And that's just my opinion. Well, it turned out that was the guy they ended up using. And I think they liked him too. But so, they seek your input and put your input in. But if I had said, no, I think that's terrible, I don't want him, they would have said, well, this is the guy we're going with. So, they collaborate with you on the audiobook, but it's one of those things that's not really in your hands. And, the cover's the same way, for example. So there's limitations on what the author's input is, because that's all considered marketing, which is not really in your hands.
How do you consume books? I mean, we're talking about audio. I'm just going to take a wild guess that you're a reader.
Yeah, I am old school. I am a read the hardcover, and when you're reading the hardcover, you take the jacket off so you don't ruin it, and then when you finish the hardcover, you put the jacket on and put it back on the shelf and keep it forever.
I am exactly the same way. Like there are a few maybe series and authors that I exclusively get the paperback for. And I can only justify that by saying his name is Chuck Klosterman, and I like the extra bit he puts into the paperbacks. But everything else is hardcover. And yes, of course you take the dust jacket off. and for me, like I guess it's OCD that I take the dust jacket off and I put it on the shelf where the book belongs,
the book was.
So it fits in when people are looking at my shelf.
Yep, that's exactly what I do. And like I don't dog ear pages. I would never dream of using the sleeve to mark my page. Like I'm a bookmark guy, or I'll have a piece of paper in it or whatever. I have recently started reading some books on Kindle. Not a lot. It's books that I'm always like, well, I don't think I'm having an emotional attachment to that. So I read stuff on there. And there's some stuff like I'm currently making my way through Alan Moore's Providence, which the only place I ever can really find it was on ebook or Comixology or whatever it is. And it's actually a better reading experience than I thought it would be, but it was definitely a learning curve.
I tried to Comixology years ago, and I'm sure it's gotten much better. But so for anybody who's listening to this, who's read my blog, I include quotes from every book I review because I feel like I can only tell you so much. And, in order to give you a snapshot of what you're about to get into, if I do my job as a reviewer properly, I want, you to either hear the author or, some poignant quote. And I'm exactly like you. I'm not going to highlight it. I'm not going to mark the page. I put the book down on my phone. I pick it up and I say, page 53, the end of the world, near the bottom.
Yep.
And then I go back after I've finished the book, and when I'm getting ready to do the review, kind of like as a refresher, I type up all my notes, and but I type up all my notes, which is the most frustrating part because I try not to mess the spine up, so I'm like kind of
right, crack the spine. Yep.
Holding it gingerly while trying to type with it's a dying art. I feel like, because I look at books as collection pieces as well.
Yeah, I mean, my wife says quite fairly that to me they're like fetishistic, which is completely fair. But I'm the same. Like I cannot write in a book. I had a professor in college who would talk about how she had a hard time because she would check out library books and she found herself writing in them. I was like, what are you talking about? How can you write in a book? And I actually tried to make myself write in a book once, and I just couldn't do it. First of all, I didn't know what to write in. I'm like, am I having a conversation with this book or what? Like, why do people feel they're compelled to write in books?
My grandmother was an English teacher. And when she died and we went through her house, and listen, my grandmother wrote in shorthand. She was a teacher for like 60 years. I couldn't even make out what she was writing in the margins of these books, but she wrote in almost every book. And wow. It wasn't like she was an English teacher. She wrote in, The Grapes of Wrath for like a lesson plan. Like there were just books that I'm sure she didn't teach that she just, there was always something in the margin. And unfortunately, I couldn't read her handwriting, so I didn't know what to make of it, but I still don't know if I would have made heads or tails of it anyway. But I cringe at that. Like I'm like right with you. I can't do it. I don't even think I did it in college when it's like, no, this is a workbook. No, I'll write on this paper. Thank you.
I would highlight, I could highlight like biology books and stuff like that, but I have this beautiful cloth-bound Chaucer book that I just couldn't do it. And that book is still on my shelf to this day. I just could not make myself highlight it.
So what are you reading? What are you consuming?
So right now, one of the things I'm reading is Alan Moore's Providence, which I love Alan Moore. And one of the things I love about him is he does do a lot of research. Like, and that's when I start to get, to the point where I'm like, well, I could maybe write something like that because he's got a lot of, research, and he's writing almost like historical fiction and things, but just, I'm not Alan Moore. There's no way. But, Providence, have you read it? Do you know about it?
I haven't read it.
It's sort of like it takes place in 1918, and it's sort of his take on the Lovecraftian universe. Like, what if there was a reporter investigating all these weird goings on, and it's just fascinating. And typical of more like the back section of it is somebody's diary and writing things. It's just so brilliantly done. I love anything Hilda, so I'm making my way through that, and it's just every issue is just fantastic. And as I said earlier, I'm reading him. I always feel like I'm not quite smart enough to read him, but I just love his stuff. I'm finishing up Midnight in Chernobyl, Higginbotham's book all about Chernobyl, which is fantastic. I actually have Grapes of Wrath on my nightstand. I read that book probably once or twice every year because I just love Steinbeck's narrative voice. It's a very distinct, very American voice. I love the way he does dialect. It's just, to me, it's just as writing as well as it can ever be done. So those are the ones that I have going right this very moment. Some of the other stuff I read earlier this year, I got in this zone where I read a biography of Chris Farley. I read one on Phil Hartman. I read David Spade's memoir. I was just going through and just reading a lot of stuff by comedians for some reason. I got in this zone on that.
So you read multiple books at a time, though?
Yeah, not always, but yeah, right now I just happen to be. One of them is like, I'm like I said, the Providence I'm reading on my Kindle, and I read that when I go to bed because the lights are out, and I can read it on the Kindle. And the other book I carry around with me, it's on my desk right now with my hat on top of it, Midnight in Chernobyl. So yeah, every once in a while I'll have one or two. I'm not somebody that can have 12 books stacked to my nightstand and I read a little bit of each all the time. I can't multitask quite that well.
See, and I've
like older.
I learned. I don't, and maybe it's the fault of having a blog and writing about it, but I learned maybe a couple of years ago that I can't, not only can I not read more than one book at once, which is fine. I can get through a book in a week and a half, 2 weeks even if I'm busy, but I can't read the same thing back to back. Like I have to try and filter between like biography and then fiction and then maybe fantasy and then I have to give myself the variety. Otherwise they end up running together on me, especially because like I was reading early on when I was reading through the Len Dayton bibliography, which I'm still doing. Like I'm 20 books in. I still have like 30 more books to go. I read 2 of them back to back, and for some reason, because they're similar and they're in a series, like I couldn't separate them. So because I couldn't separate them, I started reading them every other and then like putting other books in. And one of the things I've learned about reading, and your book is guilty of it as much as any other like nonfiction I've read, is you can't read one without getting like 3 other titles. Like I read any nonfiction book I read, I know I'm going to add to my to read list from like things that are mentioned in it. And it's just the most wonderful web, but it's still a web. So like the to read list never goes down.
Yeah.
It just always gets bigger.
And and actually, usually when I'm writing a book, I don't read outside of the project I'm working on. So it's actually been kind of nice because right now I don't know what my next project is. I've been able to just read a lot of crazy stuff. Like I said, I was reading the Phil Hartman bio and the Chris Farley book. It's the first time I've been able to kind of sit down and just plow through all this random stuff that I wasn't able to read, while I'm writing the Dr. Seuss book. All I'm reading about is Dr. Seuss and Chuck Jones, and I'm reading Dr. Seuss books and, reading about Frank Capra. So, it's like when I'm on the project, I tend to just stay on that project and I don't go off to the side a lot because I worry about, brain scope creep in that regard.
Do you write? I mean, you're in a, do you write just to keep it up as you're in between projects?
No, not really. I'm not one of those people who like can sit down and just say, today I will do a writing exercise. I kind of have to have a project to work on. And then, have the discipline to sit down every day and work on it and do things like that. But no, I don't, I used to maintain a blog. I don't really do that anymore. Not regularly. I tend to shake the cobwebs out mostly on Twitter these days more than anything else.
Is there advice you would have for, people who want to get into nonfiction writing as someone who's been there, like, and it doesn't have to be specific, just like, these are things that, having been through it make it easier?
Well, I think the first and foremost rule is the one that applies almost no matter what you're writing, and it's Stephen King has said it, and every writer I read talks about some variation of it. It's ass in the chair. That is the hardest, most painful part of doing any project. Whether you're writing fiction, poetry, a movie script, nonfiction, biography, is just sitting down and doing it. I mean, there's a saying that's something like, I can't remember who said it, but I hate writing, but I love having written, which is, very true. Sitting down, George Lucas called it bleeding on the page, and I can call the chapter on the writing Star Wars that, because that was to him, it was excruciating. And that is always the hardest part more than anything else. I'm sure you run into people who say, oh gosh, I would love to write a book someday. I just need the time. Well, the time more than anything else is you can do it. I've had a full-time job every book I've written, and the name of the game is you come home at night and you sit down in the chair and you do it. And it sucks. It sucks a lot sometimes. That's the hardest part, is just making yourself sit down and do it. And some people have routines, and they have, certain pens they need, or they have a certain notebook they need. And you know what? More power to you. Take what works for you and go with it. And I tell people who are writing biography on how they organize sources and how they organize their information. And I don't use anything electronic. There's some people that swear by Scrivener, for example. It feels like a forced extra step to me. I can't think that way. But if it works for you, by all means, use it. I don't tell anybody what the right or wrong approach is on organizing in biography and how you want to write it, because the best answer to that is it's the version of it that works best for you.
Wait, so hold on. So do you write pen on paper?
No, I don't do that.
All right.
Like Scrivener is something where you type your notes into it and scan your 3x5 cards into PDFs that you can search for them. And so, people who love it swear by it. I can't use it. Like I said, it feels like a forced step to me. I don't, I handwrite some notes, but for the most part, when I'm reading a source, I'm just typing the notes right into my laptop in a document. And then I, go through later and I move all that information downloaded into the chapter I'm working on. Other people can't do it that way. They have to write a rough draft and then an outline and a rough draft and fill in it. And that, again, to me feels like an extra step. But if it works for you, do it that way. By all means, whatever works for you, do it.
Yeah, I can't agree anymore. Like, I don't know if there's another level of agreement I can have with you on that. I've not missed a Thursday blog post in over a couple years, and it's just a weekly post. At one point, I was, throwing an extra one in Monday because I don't know, style points, but it's just 4 posts a month on average. But I'm not game and up for and completely equally inspired into every single thing. And sometimes you look and you go, all right, that's a great intro, but I don't know where to go. And you just, it's just like, write something. You need to start it. And, all writing is an avalanche, or more specifically, a boulder or a snowball running down a mountain.
Right.
The amount of effort it takes to get that thing going varies from project to project, day, time, it's sunny outside, so it's even harder to put. But once you get that thing rolling, if you're a writer, you write. And
yeah, and again, we talked earlier about rhythm and groove, and I know some people that they get up at 4:30 in the morning and they start writing starting at 4:30 in the morning, and they write till 6 o'clock, and that's when they get their best writing done. I am sorry, I cannot do that. I'm an evening person now. I'm actually best. And when I had a day job or have a day job, it works out this way because I'm best from about 8 p.m. until about 2 in the morning. And that's just the time that works for me. And there's people who are like, what are you, insane? I'd go to bed at 2 a.m. and I'd get up at 6 a.m. to go to my day job. But it's just, it's what worked for me. I can't be creative and organized and functional at 5 in the morning, but I could do it at, 1 in the morning.
You said you're in between projects. If you never wrote another book, would you be happy with what you have done?
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad I can say that actually. I mean, I'm really proud of the books I've written. And it's weird to me actually that I can pick them up and thumb through them and actually be like, okay, this is okay. I actually did this pretty well. That's a weird play. As we talked earlier, how artists are always like very self-deprecating and always hate their work and think they suck. I'm pleased at least I can pick these up and almost look at it as an outsider and read this and I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. I did a good job on this. I had to go back one day and read the chapter in the Jim Henson book on the Muppet Show for something, and actually like got caught up in it. And I got done with that. And I thought, wow, actually did that pretty well.
Is this hindsight? Yeah. Is this I've done 4 of these. I can look back at them, or did you feel this after maybe say the second or third one, or has it been that you've had this break and you get a little bit more hindsight?
I think probably the latter, having a break and having a little hindsight. Because when you do, you get your first one done, you're like, well, now I got to do the second one. And then you get the second one, you're like, well, I don't want that to be a sophomore slump. I got to do another one. I was telling, I think I was telling my agent or somebody this when I was doing the Lucas book, it was the first time I felt like I knew what I was doing. And that was my third one. And then the Seuss book, I had somebody come to me the other day and say, this one is it's so different than the other ones you've done. I could really see what you were doing. And I was like, God, really? So, I think it's interesting. I think there are some people who can see it evolve, see my style evolve. I don't see it. I go back and look at them and I think, I did my subject, justice. The one book, I go back and I read the Irving book and I'm like, I wish I could write this one again now that I know what I'm doing. But I think it still holds up okay. So yeah, I think having it's been almost a year now, that I turned that manuscript in about a year ago, that I haven't had a subject. It does give you a little bit of time to sort of breathe and take a break and look back and go, those are okay. If I didn't write another one, I guess I could be happy. I want to do another one. I'd like to keep doing it because I love doing it. But I'm pretty pleased. Most people don't get to write 4. So I feel pretty lucky in that regard too.
First off, let me say that my book fetishism is pretty much on par with Brian's, as you heard. We both like to read, we both like to collect books, prefer hardcover, and have an appreciation for special editions. I'm proud of my library, and whether you have 5 or 500 books in yours, you should take pride in your library as well. Don't have a library? Brian's got 4 books you can start your collection with. I'm not just saying that because he was on the show. I read one and I'll be reading the others once I get through the 20 or more books I currently have on my waiting list to read. But enough shilling, though that wasn't too much. I could keep going on. But I want to talk to you about something important that came up in the episode. Knowing the value of one's own work. I am in the unique position to value my own work because I'm doing it for me. While I appreciate every one of you who is listening right now, I'm doing this for me, otherwise, why do it? Which is for another discussion, actually. I find value in the creative process and in the process of doing, because from start to finish, not every podcast or even blog post is creative. Some of it is work, and I relish all of it. But as Brian learned in looking back on his 4 biography subjects, and I've learned as I've read more and more biographies, most often it takes hindsight to see value. But that doesn't mean we are all lucky enough to have the time to gain such perspective. Making time to understand the value of something can be a critical part of that project's success. It doesn't matter what it is, but you should know the value of what you are doing. Don't be too quick to sell yourself short. Make sure you know what you are worth. And it could be that something you are working on is invaluable to you or priceless. There is nothing wrong with that. Just know that even taking a break from something can give you perspective. You don't need to have 4 books with your name on them sitting on the shelf, as Brian is, or with me, a blog with over 500 posts, or a podcast with countless episodes. It could be anything. Anything. It doesn't have to be for public consumption either. Maybe you write for yourself. That has value. Maybe you take time to learn things in your spare time. That has value. Maybe you volunteer. That absolutely has value. know that everything has a value. A few episodes ago, Henno and I discussed how getting caught up in outcomes will just get you more outcomes. Understand that, true to that, the process has value as much as the outcome. More often than not, the process has the greater value than the summation of that process. Because we've all heard it before, part of the end is the journey. We all have highs and lows. We all have moments where we are more or less productive than usual. But by making sure to put value on the process itself, whatever it is, it gives us hope that we may continue to get through the hard times and sail through the easy times because they all have value. You'll have noticed by now that I've kept this pretty generic, and that's for a reason. Every time I talked about process, you thought of something. In your head, in your mind's eye, you thought of something. So, is that thing you thought of the process you were expecting to? Is it what you want? Is it not? Think on that. And while you're at it, please don't forget to say hi. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 17. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet Brian at Brian J. Jones. That's Brian J-A-Y Jones. You can visit Brian's site to see all of his works at brianjjones.com. And all of his books are available on Amazon or at your local bookstore. Plus, as always, don't forget you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer and the show at The Palmer Files. The show email is thepalmerfiles@gmail.com if you have any feedback on this or any previous episode, or if there's a topic or guest you'd like me to consider. You can also hear more of me in the meantime on Our Liner Notes, a musical conversation podcast with host Chris Meyer, and my other gig as co-host of the Podcast Digest with Dan Lizette. All right, Brian, do you have one final question for me?
I actually do here. So when it comes to biography, don't tell me a biography you would like to read the most. Tell me a biography you would like to write the most.
I attempted this with a blog post about Ralph Bakshi.
Oh, great subject.
And it was one of the first serious research things I did in the early parts of my blog. I made a decision I wanted to do a series on Ralph Bakshi, and I cleverly called it the Rotospective. So I started with Wizards, and I wrote a little bit, and it wasn't like in depth, and then it got away from me, and I basically wrote about his movies in the order I had watched them, not the order that they had been released. And when I got to like American Pop, I was writing like full on like commentaries on the movies. So it kind of got away from me. But at a certain point, I circled back and I went, all right, I'm going to write about the man now, the artist himself. And I did a lot of research, and I'm not unhappy with it, but it's very I feel like there's not a lot of heart in it. Like I tried to give it a little bit more heft maybe than I should have. Like I probably was writing out of my depth. I think now with years more experience, not just in, research, but in writing in general, I feel like I could do it better. But I feel like that's the one I would want to do most, because as an artist, he absolutely inspires me, just kind of similar to, everybody we talked about in this episode, like he wanted control, and when he didn't get that control ultimately in like Cool World, he walked away. And that's probably the one I would want to write the most.
Well, in the research, it sounds like you've already got quite a bit of it, but that's, so is it one of those you would go back years later and start, gathering your papers about you and, putting on your robe and sitting down and write? Is that one that you regret not doing, or would you go back at some point in the future and say, you know what, maybe I'll take this up again?
It's possible. It's so the idea of me writing a book has been, I don't know if it's every blogger, because I don't talk to a lot of bloggers, but my mother self-published a book, so maybe that has something to do with it. But I get a lot of, oh, you're a blogger, when are you going to write a book? And it's like, well, I mean, it's on my blog, it's on my website. Like, I've written the equivalent of a book. It's not like I can't write that many words. I just, And maybe Bakshi would be one of those scenarios of somebody I would want to write about, although he's written his own stuff that's covered himself very well. But I do get that.
Can you trust it?
I think so. I feel like he's the kind of artist that wouldn't, from that beatnik generation that just, I feel like there's a certain generation out there of, maybe they're not telling you the whole truth, but they're not sugarcoating anything.
Right.
But I always get this question of like, when are you going to write a book? And I feel like if I was inspired to do it, I would have done it already. I'm not saying it's not in the cards, but it's just, and I'm also not one of those writers who's like, you have to be inspired to write. I've written because I want to.
Well, I mean, that's a great way to look at it, because, something like a book, and especially a biography, like I was saying earlier, about a lot of biography is a fit between subject and biographer. You don't ever, in my opinion, want biography to feel like you're writing a book report, because that makes you rush things, I think, first of all. So I think your instinct on it is right. I mean, you don't necessarily have to enjoy writing it, but it needs to be one that you feel connected to. And, don't sit down at your desk and go, oh, God, here we go into this world again. Well, that's the worst thing I think can happen as a biographer. You might get to a chapter like, oh, God, this is like the really sad part of the story to write. But that's different from, God, I wish I wasn't writing this.
Well, that it does lead me to one final question back to you, which is, can you be too big of a fan to write? Like, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Ralph Bakshi. Is it possible my fandom brings me too close to the subject matter? Is that...
It can, but I think, I think it's like anything. And this sounds like I'm, trying to put an escape hatch into the question, but I think it just comes with practice on it and reading, that's why I asked you the question about, can you trust Bakshi's, memoirs? Because, you read a lot of stuff from George Lucas, and like, you can just smell the bullshit coming off of it. And, and part of you kind of lost, you're like, I'm not going to let him get away at that. So, I mean, I think that sort of comes with practice. You start to know when you start reading about your subject, what you would like to happen versus what actually happened. And I think that when you're a biographer, you want to be, true to your subject. And the best way to be true to your subject is to be honest about it. Now, you can bring your warmth to it. I mean, I was, telling somebody that I don't write takedowns. And I had somebody say, you're the only person that could ever written a biography about Jim Henson and exposed his marital infidelities and gotten away with it, and people loving him when the book is over. Because, I think in a way, I'm forgiving of Jim for that, but what I want people to do is understand Jim more than anything on that. So I think, being a fan does bring, you're bringing something to the table, but I think any subject you write about, you're going to bring something to the table that you have to contend with, whether you're writing a book about Joe McCarthy and you absolutely hate the man, and yet he's fascinating, and his story is fascinating, and what he did is fascinating, even as it's terrible. And I think that helps shape the way you tell your stories and write your narratives. I think it's what makes biographies so rich. I mean, somebody you had the same sources I had for Jim Henson, probably written a completely different book. I just think we bring our own things to it, and that's what makes biography really interesting and fun. That's why people can keep writing books on Abraham Lincoln. For the last 200 years, I think there's something like 58 books on Lincoln produced a year on average, or something like that. Everybody's got a different take they bring to it. There's a brand new biography of George Washington by Alexis Coe that's just marvelous and funny and interesting and fun. And I think that's the really fun part of biographies, because it's people telling the stories of people, and people bring their biases and their own sense of what's interesting to them to the story and to telling someone else's story.
Well, I'll leave it under consideration for. I'll add it to the to-do list.
I think that's a great place for it.
Yeah, right next to the list of all the books I still have to read.
Great.